Welcome to the Destiny of Manufacturing podcast, powered by the Precision Metal Forming Association. I am your host, Dean Phillips. And with me today, I have Jennifer Betts, who is the founder of Magnar Metals. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you, Dean. I appreciate it. I'm excited to be here.
It's fantastic to have you here. And right off the bat, what is your big takeaway looking forward for 5 years from now? What things do you see changing in manufacturing, the metals industry, and of course, women in manufacturing and technology?
The biggest thing that I'm seeing in the next 5 years is the emphasis that we are going to have to put on sustainability, whether that comes from carbon emissions reductions or comes from the recycled material space. My background, a lot of the experience that I've had in this industry has been in the raw material space, specifically the recycled material space. In the United States in particular, our manufacturing would not operate without the recycled materials industry at all. And so we really do need to put an emphasis on that in the next 5 years of really raising awareness to make sure that we are sustainable as well as self-sustainable as a country as well. And you're going to see more and more folks getting into that space and really pushing those initiatives.
Can you explain a little bit about that for people that are unaware for raw materials, that when you make metals, a lot of times you just don't make them from raw materials. You have to start with recycled materials. Can you explain a little bit about that to people that may be unfamiliar with that aspect of it?
Absolutely. So before I got into this industry, I thought your aluminum can, for instance, went into the blue bin at the end of your driveway and then poof, magically, it turned into an aluminum can. There is a whole world behind that blue bin. And actually, it's not where the majority of the recycling comes from in the United States. The majority of the recycled materials is coming from industrial sources. Something that the United States should be really proud of, for instance, is our steel industry, our steel manufacturing industry. 70% of the steel that's manufactured in the United States today is made with recycled materials. So 70% of the steel industry, there's essentially two different ways to make steel. You can make it from essentially ore, from the scratch, mining, converting it. It's the full integrated process. Or there's something called the electric arc furnace, EAF for short. That uses up to 100% of recycled materials, recycled iron, recycled steel in the furnace to essentially make the new steel. So 70% of the steel that we make in the United States comes from recycled materials. So it's something that most people are not aware of. You think your car at the end of life just, I don't know, disappears. But in reality, your car that you're driving today, it probably has your old washer and dryer in it. It probably has parts of your old car in it. And it just isn't talked about that that's actually how we support a lot of our manufacturing in the United States. And it's not just steel. Aluminum uses a lot of recycled materials, copper, brass, stainless steel. It's a big driver of our economy.
That's an incredible point, because I think oftentimes people just look at it as raw material. When we've used it in different manufacturing processes, there could be such a wide variety, even within one steel plate, let's say a 10-foot plate. The material can have hard spots, soft spots, all because of the material that gets melted down and combined within that, because there just happens to be whatever you happen to melt down and how it got blended in the furnace and how it turned out. What got you interested in this? How did you come about getting involved in metals?
A career fair in college is probably the easiest answer. I was a finance major. I should not have been in metals, right? I was not STEM. I come from a long line of engineers. My grandfather was a civil engineer. My father was a nuclear engineer by trade. And then my brother is a mechanical engineer by trade. I should have been an engineer. And it just wasn't in my path. And so at a career fair, the first company that started talking to me, and honestly, they were probably standing next to the company that I really wanted to talk to, I started talking to them and I thought, you know what, I'll use them for practice. And I went through this whole interview process. And eventually it got to the point where, okay, wait a second. You're going to give me a company car. You're going to give me an expense account and you're going to let me just go travel the country finding scrap metal or recycled materials to go trade. And it's this whole commodity exchange behind the scenes. Yeah, that sounds great. I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that instead of the finance route. And so my first job out of school was for the David J. Joseph Company. And it eventually, while I was working there, got purchased by Nucor Steel. So I worked at essentially Nucor for about 7 years on the non-ferrous side originally. So I know the aluminum, copper, stainless steel world, as well as I worked on the ferrous side, purchasing recycled materials for a variety of their melt shops. And then
That's incredible.
And then I just stayed in it for almost a couple decades at this point.
I think a lot of people don't always get into it because that was their first thought. I know when I got into manufacturing, that was not my first thought. I was in electronics and everybody said, I'm going to go in this direction. But then when you start to work in this industry and you start to meet people, it's the metals industry is a phenomenal, it's a very tight knit group. And it's a group that I think very much cares about each other, cares about the outcome of how do we do things. And there's a definite interest in how are things made? How can we do things better? How can we come up with new ways? The furnaces that we have in the country have changed a lot too. You know, you look at how much that has changed things. Mm-hmm. And what technologies do you see coming into the metals industry and how will that impact us?
There has been a significant increase in technology that has entered the metals industry in general, from the raw materials aspect of it, there are some very sophisticated automobile shredders and downstream systems in terms of just processing out the various metals, all the way to the steel mill manufacturers and to the end processors, the service centers. They're getting really fascinating technology. I was on the call the other day with somebody that was talking about how essentially a mega digital printer, which for folks outside the manufacturing world are probably going to be like, well, why haven't you done this before? Well, because we couldn't. And so there's a digital printer essentially now that you're able on a 60-inch wide piece of metal, essentially, that can print up to 12 font on it, right? Into steel, aluminum, whichever metal that it's going into, up to 30 feet long. That didn't exist 5 years ago, right? That's incredibly fascinating. The safety technology measures that we've been able to input into a lot of our manufacturing, especially in and around furnaces, has been incredible in recent years. I was in Pittsburgh a few years ago and I took a tour of a now dormant steel mill, and it was one of the integrated original steel mills. And the history there, where it wasn't common or wasn't unlikely for somebody to get injured on a daily basis in those types of operations around the turn of 1900s, we've come a very long way from that. And so we are in a much healthier safety environment today than we were, and technology plays a huge part in that.
Yeah, it's great that you brought that up, because when I look at how industry has responded to some of these challenges, I've toured the facility up in, I think it's up in West Orange at the Edison Museum, and they still, last time I was there, they still had line belts. So a line shaft that went through the plant, and then they had a leather belt that goes over the machines. And that's how it was. And there was just this open leather belt that was just going around and around, and people could easily get their hands in there, easily, get hair caught in it. And how much that had changed. When I started at a company called Niagara Machine and Tool Works back in the early 90s, they had products going back to the early 20s. And we would get calls regularly. Hey, what size motor? It didn't come with a motor. We didn't ship machines with the motor back in those days. They came with a flywheel and just hooked onto a leather belt. And that's how you ran those machines in those days. But through evolution and through time, we've learned more. We've gotten better at regulating safety and preventing injuries around the plants. We now realize we have to have guards at a certain height so people can't just reach up and put their hand into hazardous locations.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing. And in the metals, when you start talking about molten metals, it is a very different world. If you've never walked through a plant, by all means, if you have an opportunity to do that, please do, because it will change the way you think about how things are manufactured forever. There's a lot of die casting plants that we have down here in Tennessee. And when we've gone through and toured those, the temperature you have when that molten steel is flowing into a machine and when they're hot forging materials, it is incredible. And you have to be very careful, because one thing that molten metals don't like, water. When you get water near it, it sparks and everything just explodes basically. Have you seen other areas besides just safety? Have they started to explore more things like AR, VR to notice when people are in areas they shouldn't be and hazardous locations? Is that some other areas that they've started to really emphasize safety in?
There is some of that going on, actually in slightly unrelated to the metals world, but it is in the manufacturing world. My husband used to work for GE Aviation, and they were looking into using Google Glasses to be able to help the mechanics to make sure that out of the 20 lug nuts in between flights where they needed to make sure that they tightened everything up, that in real time, if one of those 20 didn't reach the right torque, they would be notified through the Google Glasses. And I think there's a lot of that's coming down the pipeline, especially in the metal space, is that you're seeing the benefits of how AR, VR can be used in real life. It's also really great in terms of metals manufacturing, in terms of identifying issues or quality concerns, being able to essentially anticipate that happening along the line.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see some of these changes starting to take place in there. How do you see recycling getting more emphasized in the industry? How can we take better notice of that and get more involved in it?
It's something that's going to come from an education standpoint. I have friends that still don't understand what I do, right? It's not something that most people are aware of. They think of the blue bin and then that's it, right? Whereas in reality, if you work in manufacturing and you work with anything in metals, and really honestly in any type of materials, I bet you're aware of those bins or boxes at the back of your facility that are collecting those scraps, right? But you probably aren't aware of necessarily the full supply chain that those materials go through and come along. For instance, a lot of the auto manufacturers in the United States produce scrap, right? It's a really great industrial source, if you will. And educating individuals on how recycling affects manufacturing on a day-to-day basis is going to be truly key. Because without the recycled materials that we have in the United States, with 70% of our steel mills running off of it, we would be in a world of hurt. So we just need to get more exposure, more education out there so that people are truly aware of how recycling not only benefits the planet, but it also benefits us economically.
I know, looking back now, probably half a decade or so, China was buying up a lot of scrap at that time for their mills and for their processes.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that that's one of the things that you wouldn't think that when it comes to materials that the scrap would have such a high value, but it was, and it went to a very high level. I don't know what it is now. I'm not as plugged into that. I'm sure you are, but it has definitely changed. I see some of the tube materials have gone up dramatically here with some recent price increases.
Mhm.
And as those prices go, so do the scraps. A lot of time that increases in price too.
Absolutely. There's a whole commodity trading world behind metals that most people are unaware of. If you want a really good book recommendation, The World for Sale is actually a really fascinating commodities driven book. It's by a couple reporters from Bloomberg, and it's really fascinating. It's basically as if James Bond was a commodity trader. I mean, some of the stories are completely true and completely unbelievable in some of the things that they were doing. But a lot of folks are not aware that if there's metal in it, there is a value. Even holiday lights, right? At the end of the year, they're broken, whatever. That has value. That's actually a scrap trade, a scrap grade that I've traded before, right? You can buy holiday lights. It's essentially an ICW, an insulated copper wire. It's a variety. You do it based on the percentage of the copper versus the plastic in those types of grades. But essentially you're buying it for the metal that's in there. And then you send it either overseas or to a domestic wire chopper. And they're able to essentially chop and use technology to essentially shake out based on the density. The copper goes over here, and then the plastics go over here. And then they can usually reuse the plastic, and then they can resell the copper chops. It's fascinating how most people think, metals, but not really, how did we get that metal? How did it come from? A lot of where we are manufacturing wise and where we're going is going to rely on recycled materials. Bauxite, which is the base of aluminum, if you will, the ore, it's very plentiful. Okay. We can mine it pretty much anywhere in the world, but it's incredibly energy intensive. It's not great for us long term. So we're going to have to rely on recycling aluminum, especially aluminum cans and other products like that, because the demand that we're seeing in a lot of the technology world, like EV batteries, lithium ion, things like that, are going to require us to recycle what we've already mined out of the earth for energy reasons, and also just from a sustainable standpoint. We're not going to be able to keep up with demand if we don't put an emphasis on recycling what we've already mined out of the earth.
Right. I know you're very passionate about getting women interested in the metals industry. Tell us some of the things that you've been involved in and what you'd like to do as you move forward.
Absolutely. I'm approaching a couple decades in this industry. And at this point, I've completed more or less the full supply chain. I've gone from the raw materials side to the steel mills, trading companies. I've worked at a metals publication, as well as the steel and aluminum service center. And the people that I've met in this industry have been fascinating, incredible. There's been really rich histories there. They're extremely educated in their niche and what they specialize in. But one thing that I've noticed over the years is that there hasn't been a huge emphasis on promoting or highlighting women, or essentially just more diverse voices that are in this industry. There are some great organizations out there that are working on it. The Association of Women in the Metals Industry is a fantastic one. Women in Manufacturing is another great one. ISRI, which is the Institute of Scrap Recycling Industries, the recycled materials arm, they have a women in recycling group as well. Getting those groups together is a great first step. The next is more or less using voices like mine or encouraging other women in the industry to just start putting out their voices, their opinions on social media. Post with your expertise, put something out there. And so the next generation can start seeing these faces that they can recognize and relate to. That's how we're going to start seeing an increase in the diversity in the metals and manufacturing space.
That's fantastic. Well, I really appreciate you coming on the show today. Tell us how people can reach you.
Absolutely. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm Jennifer Sherman Betts. You can also find me on TikTok as I try to reach that next generation. That's a more unique, interesting one. Find me at Hedge Your Bets. And I'm also on the other locations of Facebook, Instagram, etc., YouTube Shorts. If there's anything that I can do, I love to support people that are interested in this industry, if I can make a connection for someone, introduce them, or even just help educate them about the opportunities that are in this industry, by all means, feel free to reach out to me.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time today. And thank you to the Precision Metal Forming Association for helping us put this on today. I again am Dean Phillips, your host, and we have with us, of course, Jennifer Betts, who is here from Magnar Metals. Everybody have a great day.
Thank you, Dean. Appreciate it.